Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening for what's sure to be a very engaging conversation. My name, for those who don't know me, is Michael Schwartz. I'm the Director of Community Engagement here at the Jewish Museum and Archives of BC. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to this very special kickoff event to mark the 50th anniversary of the Jewish Museum and Archives of BC, something we'll be celebrating for the rest of the year. For the past half century, it's been our mandate to preserve, document, and celebrate the history of Jewish life in BC. And while our community has deep roots here, dating back 162 years, this is but a blink of the eye compared to the proud history of our three host nations, the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. We're very grateful to these nations for their stewardship of the land for millennia and for granting us the privilege of joining them to live, work, and play in these breathtaking lands. Thank you. When we read over the early publications of our founders, we can clearly see how much of a struggle it was to report on the early history of our community. Few documents remain, and researchers relied heavily on the recollections of community elders who'd been here at the turn of the century and earlier. But thanks to their work and the work of many who joined in the effort over the years, our archives have grown into a robust resource for the researchers of today and tomorrow. Over 900 oral history interviews, 325,000 photographs, and 320 linear meters of textual data, all safeguarded in professional grade storage facilities. This is a testament to the value of our work and a demonstration of our principle to be a mirror for the community, to gather the histories of everyone. Tycoons and housewives, politicians, teachers, entrepreneurs, rabbis, athletes, scholars, and more. Ours strives to be an inclusive archives. This evening's talk will address this idea of inclusivity and interrogate what it truly means to be inclusive. For all of us who work in museums and archives, and all of us who care about these institutions, it promises to be an instructive and thought-provoking talk. This summer, museums, monuments, and public history were thrust into the headlines as rarely before. As civil rights demonstrations marched through the streets of cities around the world, history came barreling into the public consciousness to an almost unprecedented degree. At that time, work was underway. We were planning how we wanted to mark the 50th anniversary of our organization, and it became immediately apparent that this would be a marvelous opportunity for a very engaging and reflective keynote talk. The question then became who to invite. And it took very little discussion to arrive at a decision to invite Elizabeth Shaffer, Dr. Elizabeth Shaffer, Executive Director of the Residential School History and Dialogue Center and Assistant Professor at the School of Information at UBC, that Dr. Shaffer would be the perfect person to fill this role. When I began my career in the heritage sector, my first job was as an intern at the Vancouver Holocaust Education Center. And there I had the privilege of working alongside a team of thoughtful and brilliant women who were and remain extremely dedicated to their craft. I took countless lessons from this experience that still come back to me daily. It was my boot camp, so to speak. And among this team was Elizabeth Shaffer, our speaker this evening. Over lunch and on the drives to work, we had many in-depth discussions about museums, history, and public memory. And since those days, Elizabeth has gone on to earn her PhD and join the faculty at the School of Information at UBC. And when we learned recently that Elizabeth had been named the Executive Director of the Residential School History and Dialogue Center at UBC, I was immensely proud of my old friend. So as we reflect on the place of history in our communities, in our society, and the role that museums and archives play in provoking and facilitating that dialogue and discussion, we look to thinkers like Elizabeth to help us navigate this space. So I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Elizabeth Shaffer, a keynote speaker. Elizabeth, I hand it over to you. Thanks so much.
Wonderful. So first of all, thank you so very much, Michael, for such a generous and thoughtful introduction. And I love how you say VHEC Bootcamp. As you know, the VHEC is a place that is very dear to my heart, and I have an immense amount of respect for, and humility for having also been to VHEC Bootcamp and privileged those relationships to this day and moving forward. So thank you. Good evening. And as some of you might have heard as I was speaking with Michael, not realizing everyone was hearing, I had intended to take to do this talk from the center, which you see on the screen in front of you at the University of British Columbia. In a post-code environment, I would invite you all to come visit the space. We're very proud of it, and it's an amazing, engaging space for conversations like this. So please, the door is open, and I welcome you in as soon as we are actually open. But having said that, there's been some technical difficulties with computers on campus today, Mac computers, and so I was challenged with my laptop all day, and so I thought I'd better just stick close to home and work on my desktop so I could honor this commitment. But it does mean that I'm at home, and I do apologize in advance if you happen to hear any pets in the background. So again, apologies. So good evening. And thank you for the invitation to speak to the Jewish Museum and Archives of BC Annual General Meeting, and particularly on this very auspicious occasion of your 50th anniversary. I'm honored to be here with you virtually and share some reflections on the shifting role of museums and archives in contemporary society, and propose some provocations on how they may be or continue to be sites of dialogue and disruption moving forward. I would like to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you today from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. Previously as a student and now as a faculty member at UBC, I continue to benefit from being an uninvited guest on Musqueam as well as these lands, for which I am most grateful. So talking about museums and archives as spaces of dialogue and disruption is a privilege and a wonderful opportunity to share with you. So first, I'll briefly share some thoughts on what motivates me to do this work at the nexus of investigating policy, practices, and systems with particular attention to social justice issues, impacts of colonialism, and collections that document traumatic human events. So essentially in efforts to hold space for anti-racism and human rights-based education and dialogue. Next, I will discuss the power museums and archives have to shape collective remembering and problematize the role of museums and archives as they have historically existed, inviting us to think about questions of colonial disruption. Whose voices are amplified in museums and archives, and whose are marginalized or non-existent? Third, in response to the challenging climate we currently find ourselves in, as well as growing discourse and efforts towards reconciliation and decolonization, I will posit that one way toward colonial disruption in museum and archival praxis is to be bold in our reimaginings of the potential for museums and archives to support and promote diversity and inclusion. Excuse me. Drawing attention to a few examples, I will highlight ways in which museums and archives can work to positively disrupt in service to unity seeking and in support of generative dialogues. So additionally, I will offer some provocations, excuse me. Additionally, I will offer some provocations. Sorry, it sounds like it's, is this better? This is better, thanks. Okay, I'll be louder, thank you. I just want to see that, I want to make sure you could hear me. Yes, closer to the mic. Sorry. Additionally, I will offer some provocations on participatory co-construction of collective memory and individuals and communities, surfacing injustice, promoting transparency of practices and histories of collecting, and developing and nurturing sites of agency and pluralism in service to human rights, the surfacing of truth, and efforts toward decolonization. Finally, during this talk, I would like to invite us to hold space for imagination and positing what's possible moving forward. how we might challenge our institutions, cultural heritage professionals, and ourselves to work to create non-oppressive spaces to hold challenging and difficult conversations. So what is the role of our institutions and of ourselves in working towards reconciliation, decolonization, and social justice? So as Michael mentioned, before joining the Residential School History and Dialogue Center, I was the Director of Collections at the Vancouver Holocaust Education Center, where it was a privilege to lead a team that developed some digital systems that really put the users at the center of the collections experience, broaden contextual capacities and understandings across communities and disciplines in support of anti-racism education and exhibition curation on issues of genocide. And I would say that I think many of us could agree the VHEC is really the gold standard for anti-racism education, anti-genocide education, not only in Western Canada, but I would say internationally. In my doctoral research, I explore potential challenges of accountability, accessibility, and social remembering when emerging technologies are taken up by public servants in government. So my research focused on early adoption of social media in the Canadian federal government, but its motivation was really seeing these conversations and dialogues happen during the TRC, in social media platforms and in a context of spaces. So thinking about what did this mean to long-term social remembering? What did it mean that we were able to draw, during the TRC process, draw on records that were over 150 years old that had once been analog and bring consequence to bear, have redress, and bring some, move towards healing and reconciliation as a country to understand those truths. However, if much of what we were generating were on for-profit platforms and digital spaces, while these might have a democratizing effect for individuals to share conversations, they continually challenge long-term remembering and thinking about the challenges we had as we move through this process as a country, as individuals, as First Nations, and as communities. So this led me to really think about what that meant. And so I explored ideas like the right to know and the duty to remember. So this is the UN Declaration based in human rights in post-colonial, post-conflict societies. And it really talks about the right to access records of regimes and hold perpetrators and governments accountable. So Louis Joinet, who was the first drafter of what went on to be a number of different principles that are continually revisited, said, quote, "The right to know is not simply the right to any individual victim or closely related persons to know what happened, a right to the truth. The right to know is also a collective right, drawing upon history to prevent violations from recurring in the future. Its corollary is the duty to remember, which the state must assume in order to guard against the perversions of history that go under the names of revisionism and negationism. The knowledge of the oppression it has lived through is part of the people's national heritage and as such must be preserved." So this was very much the motivation for much of the work I undertook. While it took on more of a general guise of social media technology and adoption, as I mentioned, in the government, they're really the motivating factors. And I think what continually draws me back to this work is that idea of human rights, upholding human rights and social justice work that gets me excited. So some of the questions that I surfaced in the context of this research were, what happens when these records are generated through owned and controlled by social media platforms? So really looking at it through a critical lens. And we're going to circle back to that a little bit later in the talk. So now I'd like to move on to the power of museums and archives. So really museums as sites of friction and colonization. Excuse me. So as Michael alluded to in the introduction, this past summer, with the killing of George Floyd, triggered a series of responses which culminated into large and sustained civil rights and Black Lives Matter protests that really has been increasing in the spotlight: anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, and other forms of racism in society. The momentum for calls to embrace systemic and lasting change really felt different this time, as many people echoed, and reached across the globe and into a number of sectors, including the cultural heritage space. This led to an increase in the call for the removal and taking down of monuments to frictious and troubling pasts. These monuments often celebrate and memorialize historical figures who were complicit in racism, oppression, slavery, theft of land, and in Canada, the Indian residential school system. Statues of slave owners, Confederate heroes, colonizers, and racist ideologies. All these monuments were coming down, or calls for them were being, or they were being called to come down, and calls for increased public discourse about why these monuments were problematic for so many was coming into the public discourse. So the history around us is continually present via these markers. It contributes to our identity, the way we operate in the spaces, the normative way in which we feel comfortable or discomfort, the way we feel that we have a right to be in spaces, the way our voices are heard and respected in spaces. These are all informed by things like monuments that surround us in everyday life, in cultural heritage spaces that we enter. So who counts? And what their value is relative to the normative framework of institutions, public spaces, and discourse. So arguably toppling monuments present yet another opportunity for dialogue. So I'd like here just to briefly pull in my colleague and friend, Dr. Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafond, who is quoted by CBC when you'll see on the right here, it's your left or right, my apologies. She's the law professor that this article is talking about, and she's quoted as saying, as if the only figures worthy of having in a monument are those of European background who came and so-called discovered North America. So she advocates, so this is how when people who are not a normative type, perhaps Indigenous peoples, people of color, Black people see these monuments, this is the implicit message they're sent, that these are the people who are to be lauded regardless. And the idea of examining these, they're holding space to examine these, is now coming into the public discourse. So she advocates for re-examining the memorialization of these figures and statues, but also in street names and schools, and recognizing those names that uphold Canada's colonial legacy. So what would it look like if we were to challenge and engage in dialogue? So again, we circle back to that idea of dialogue. It's not about just toppling without a conversation. When Michael and I were preparing for this talk and I was chatting with him, he asked me, well, what do you think should happen to these? And I think there's room. We don't want erasure, I would argue, but we want context. And the question you could posit is, do these belong in a museum? Do they belong, the records of these monuments belong in an archive? What does that mean? To again, have the discourse, not to erase history, but to better understand it, contextualize it, and bring it face to face with our contemporary challenges of many of the systems that we're facing today. So I continue this conversation further about the role of museums and archives. And so on the left, we have the British Museum. And so the British Museum is an iconic museum known the world over, and is also embroiled in controversy right now around the Elgin marbles, around the Rosetta Stone, around many artifacts and belongings that were taken during colonial times, and many calls for repatriation have been lauded. At the same time, for those of us who work in the cultural heritage sector, I can only speak for myself, I would say, the British Museum is an amazing place. It is a place that I fell in love with and continually to go back to as a space for dialogue and discourse, as a space for understanding history, as a space for contextualizing our contemporary understandings of where we come from. But at the same time, if history is presented through a colonial gaze, then it presents the sites of friction if those who are represented in museum displays and museum discourse see themselves as othered. So this past September, just a few months ago, the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford removed some shrunken heads from display after they reviewed their constructs. If you've ever been to the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, it's kind of like a Victorian curiosity shop. It is a phenomenal collection of amazing artifacts and belongings from around the world. However, I had the privilege of going there a number of years ago and was disconcerted when I was in there, and felt very othered, and was very challenged by the shrunken heads that they discuss in this. I happened to be at a summer program at the University of Oxford, and started this dialogue with my colleagues about how challenged this made me feel. And what was so challenging, even more so for me, was the reaction of my colleagues. These are colleagues I respect and work with in contemporary context today, and value as friends as well. But they really didn't see my point. They really didn't understand what the harm was as to why these things were displayed the way they were, and that I should kind of get over it. And it wasn't meant in a derogatory, mean way. It was just, lighten up. And I think this is part of the problem, is that because we've normalized the way we think about history, we've put it through a lens of the colonizer, and we haven't given equal voice and equal, opportunity and space to those who are colonized to hold positions of power, to hold spaces in ways that challenge these normative frameworks. Then we have these ideas that if you kind of, are upset by these things, then you're kind of touchy, which in the cultural heritage space, we could say is definitely a site of friction. So the power of museums and archives to shape collective social remembering is very strong. Museums are not neutral spaces where unbiased curation practices are engaged. So what is the role of museums and archives in contemporary society? What opportunities do they hold for affecting change moving forward? Are they positioned to support social change? Should they be supporting social change? So another thing to think about in this, and the story I've just shared with you, is really thinking about our own positionality. So as we engage in these spaces, our roles as museums and archive professionals, as scholars, as curators, as educators, as museum goers, as donors, as parents, these should all be questions we should be thinking and asking ourselves, and thinking long about our own positionality when we're in these spaces, and what kind of power or disempowerment do we experience when we move through these spaces. So when we think about museum and archives as sites of power, as I mentioned, we think about our roles and responsibilities. We also think about the institutions and the professionals that occupy the space. And we think about the complexities of museums. Museums have very different, structured and complex funding models. They rely on public money, they rely on donor money. They answer to a multitude of, audiences and benefactors. So this complicates things they can do and statements they might make. But again, I would argue, after this summer with the civil rights protests and the Black Lives Matter movement, we really saw some different statements coming out. We saw some boldness, and we saw some opportunity for people to really think about what would it mean to affect systemic change. So in Canada, we live in a state of settler colonialism, arguably, and so we think about ideas of decolonization, but since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has done its work, we also think about reconciliation. And so I would say again, what is the role of museums and archives in working towards reconciliation? What are our positionalities and our responsibilities as participants in those enterprises towards moving towards reconciliation in a settler colonial state? So what does that mean to representation of marginalized communities? And when we think about the TRC calls to action, four of them called on museums and archives to use the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a framework to test their policies, their practices, to get them in line, to start to understand what that means to hold this information, to hold this, the information about people, without necessarily the agency and the positionality of the people whom it's about to have any say in how it's used, how it's displayed, for instance, similar to things like the Pitt Museum. So that then brings us to, what role does community have in participatory practices if we think this is a way forward? Arguably, museums and archives can be more collaborative, working alongside communities who are choosing to document their own histories and experiences. Many choose not to engage with normative paradigms, which traditionally be exclusionary, marginalized, and problematic for many in society. So again, we circle back to technology. As these increase and grow, we see many marginalized communities opting out of traditional cultural heritage spaces and telling their own stories in their own way. What does that mean? Do we choose to partner? Do more normative institutions choose to partner with folks like this and bring expertise and resourcing to bear? Or is there a relationship and a conversation to be had there? So Andrew Flynn and Mary Stevens, who are archival scholars who specialize particularly in community archives, say, quote, "The endeavor by individuals and groups to document their history particularly if that history has been generally subordinated or marginalized, is political and subversive. These recast histories, and they're making challenge and seek to undermine both the distortions and omissions of orthodox historical narratives, as well as the archives and heritage collections that sustain them. So if we think about, I would argue, not only these communities doing this work as subversive and political, but the institutions that have been doing it for decades and hundreds of years in some cases, potentially those are also political acts of colonization, and how they display this information, how they filter it, how they present it, who is displayed and who is not. So again, I come back to that role of technology in the democratizing process. So digital technologies such as web and social media platforms, open source collection, exhibition platforms have supported the agency of communities to document themselves, opening up an opportunity and generating a challenge for traditional collecting and curating practices, but I would argue also an opportunity. In the face of contemporary technologies such as for-profit social media platforms, are museums spaces that can hold space for dialogue, that support greater transparency about their practices? What is the role of the moderator in these digital platforms? So there's been an ongoing shift in the traditional role of archives and museums as custodians of society's records and the tellers of their stories. So when we think about issues like trust, so underdocumented communities traditionally excluded or written out of archives, historically, there's been no work to develop relationships of trust and reciprocity. So we're not invested in these larger collective remembering efforts. For instance, they often don't see themselves represented in national archives or in national museums, without being othered, without having a participatory voice in those, if they're represented at all. So they would not trust the documentation and preservation entities of governments, which have historically marginalized them at best, and actively engaged in impressing and or eradicating them at worst. So the power is necessarily in line for a shift, and potentially what we're seeing now is a move to a stronger shift. And we're seeing this through participatory archiving in communities, as I said, in curation by communities about themselves, more pluralistic and holistic approaches to archival and museum praxis, the democratizing of archives. Longtime archival scholar Terry Cook challenges archivists to achieve a more democratic, inclusive, and holistic archives, pivoting away from centralizing the state and moving towards centering citizens and communities at the core of museum and archival praxis. So we need to recognize that archiving and curating are political acts and revisit ideas of ownership, control, access, and power. We need to disrupt power relations. So who is accessing and mediating the access to these records? Is it the communities themselves, or is it, or is it the institutions who control the records of information about these communities? But arguably, as I say, museums are sites of friction and colonization, as are archives. So, and we've seen this come to the surface. So while we have institutions such as the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, the Royal BC Museum and Archives, who have been doing very stellar work and strong work in surfacing issues of human rights. In the Royal BC Museum is much lauded for its repatriation program of Indigenous materials back to communities and its language programs around making individuals and communities information accessible to Indigenous communities in British Columbia. So many of these have been, in the public discourse, but at the same time, we see these challenges surface. And we see that what we're talking about are these institutions are inherently colonial and inherently have a lot of problems in their policies and in their practices that continually marginalize, that continually other those individuals who are not usually part of that normative conversation. So it has often been, again, a more normative structure of people working in museums, working in archives, working in cultural heritage spaces, and collecting and displaying others. So when others come into these spaces, often, you know, as the first or few people that work in these institutions as people of color, as Indigenous people, and, you know, gender, race, you know, heteronormativity, all of these things come into play. So when these people are, when folks like this are in this space, then other challenges arise. And this is where we see these. Now, to be fair, these institutions are investigating and looking into these and have committed to work to make these spaces better. But it just shows you that it's not just what the museum does that needs addressing in this decolonization, or what I would argue is colonial disruption, but it's actually how it is and how it chooses to be. So if we need to kind of clean our house, as someone said the other day, as these institutions, and be transparent and think about what that means for the long term. So imagining what's possible. So increasingly, archival scholars, for instance, are calling for decolonization of archival and museum practice. However, for Indigenous scholars Crystal Fraser and Zoe Todd, who problematized decolonizing archives in Canada, a settler colonial state system, such efforts at decolonization can only ever be partial, they would argue, as it would require, quote, an erasure or negation of the colonial realities of the archives themselves. So engaging with questions of control, access, content, and silences, Fraser and Todd argue not for decolonizing the archives, and potentially I could argue you could also add museums, but for acknowledgement of the quote inherent colonial paradigms that inform and shape the archives as institutions, and instead move towards, quote, applying a historically informed, critical decolonial sensibility in engaging the archives. So really what they're talking about again is there is no decolonization possible, but there is a way to approach this work in ways that can hold up and laud the ideas of colonial disruption, and really have a critical gaze on what we're looking at and how we're doing that work with transparency and thoughtfulness. So, excuse me. When I started this discourse, I also talked about the power. So according to South African archival scholar Vern Harris, who has been decades working in the Nelson Mandela Center in South Africa, quote, the archival record, like all repositories of memory, is an extraordinary creation of remembering, forgetting, and imagining. The archival record is at once expression and instrument of power. I think that's a pretty impressive statement and pretty beautiful to me. It does hold a lot of power, but it holds power at many levels. It holds the power to surface collective memory, to surface individual memory, but it also holds the power to shape who should be remembered and who should be forgotten or who's left out. By illuminating the South African context, Harris highlights the power at play within archives and the space they occupy in society. As he states, it is the extreme circumstances of oppression and rapid transition to democracy that the power at archives is surfaced. The constant challenge of negotiating, surfacing, engaging, and struggling with this implicit and explicit power is the ongoing work of archivists who are, quote, subject to the call of and for justice, according to Harris. He pushes against any calls of impartiality and instead argues that engagement with work within archival praxis to disrupt and disconfit the existing power structures works in service to justice. So archival scholars writing in what is often referred to as the archival turn, or kind of I think it's probably from the 80s onward, a turn away from notions of archival neutrality and impartiality, and towards a recognition of the power and agency of archivists and archives in shaping the archival record and influence collective social memory. They draw our attention to archives as what archival scholars Cook and Schwartz term, quote, sites for the contestation of power, memory, and identity. They argue that archives have always been sites of power and have great authority over social memory and constructionists of past, present, and future. I read you a quote. Through archives, the past is controlled. Certain stories are privileged and others marginalized. Archivists continually reshape, reinterpret, and reinvent the archive. This represents enormous power over memory identity, over the fundamental ways in which society seeks evidence of what its core values are and have been, where it has come from, and where it is going. Archives, then, are not passive storehouses of old stuff, but active sites where social power is negotiated, contested, and conferred, end quote. So that power that is continually reenacted through memory work, that shapes and reshapes, activates and reactivates, not a static repository, but a dynamic and ever-evolving space that is called upon to be reshaped and decolonized in service to greater assertion of rights in relation to records and greater transparency in the colonial foundations of archival praxis. So now I'd like to turn, excuse me, to a few examples. So when Michael asked me to do this talk, he asked me to share with him some examples. I would like to now share. I just want to check my time. I think I'm good. Michael, please just send me a quick chat if I'm cutting it close. I probably have about 10 more minutes or so, but I can skip through a couple. Thank you. So I picked a few that I'm personally involved in, as you can see from the Residential School History and thanks, Michael, from the History and Dialogue Center, and then a couple that I've observed through the work that I've done that I think are doing some innovative things to kind of start to call towards this work. So the Indian Residential School History and Dialogue Center at UBC addresses the colonial legacy of residential schools, other policies imposed by the Canadian government on Indigenous peoples, and ensures that this history is acknowledged, examined, and understood within the UBC community and beyond. The center works with partners across disciplines at UBC and beyond to facilitate dialogues and access to records and information that support engaging the legacies of the residential school system and the ongoing impacts of colonialism in Canada. This work supports teaching and learning at UBC and the work of UBC's Indigenous Strategic Plan by supporting Indigenous peoples' self-determination and working in partnership with partners and communities. So it's establishing itself as an institution for culturally informed, reciprocal, community-led research, education, and dialogue in partnership with Indigenous communities, with survivors, and with constituents at UBC. So as a survivor-centered and trauma-informed space, we work in service to Indigenous communities and peoples of Canada. So we draw on community engagement, we draw on emergent technology that I've been discussing to really facilitate engagement, support dialogue, and really have more transparent information practices. So as a framework that really works to privilege respectful, equitable, and innovative access to records and information, the center is developing systems, spaces of inquiry, are keen to model new platforms for information stewardship, particularly those relating to collections that hold records of traumatic events, such as the Indian residential school system, and essentially one that is pluralistic and seeks to support agency, so agency for the individuals and communities whom these records are about. We do this with digital technologies, through dialogues, and through a number of other partnerships and practices in this regard. So what I have on the screen here are, the site, the collection site, a page from there. This was an exhibition we had during the Congress, Congress of the Humanities, the SSHRC Social Science Research Congress of the Humanities, over a summer ago now, last summer. My summer is confused. And then what I have on the right here I wanted to share with you is we've held a number of dialogues with communities and with survivors, really seeking direction, seeking input, seeking collaboration on what should happen to, how should we steward and guide and present and preserve the records that UBC has, everything from research records to, residential school records at our center and others about Indigenous communities. So instead of studying and quantifying Indigenous communities, having Indigenous communities steer the conversation and have agency over what that means. So survivors, this one is particularly relevant to survivors. So what does it mean to have agency over one's stories? What does it mean to have agency and input into how those stories are told, how this history is taught? So we look to principles of engagement, of collaboration, of openness, innovation, particularly in digital technologies and use of spaces. We look to seek flexibility and support plurality and agency. We look not just at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but at a much broader context. So we think about pulling the thread back to contact, pulling it forward to the 60s scoop, to overrepresentation of children in care, to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So all of these are inherently in the sphere of the residential school system and colonialism in a settler nation like Canada. So we look to community engagements and collaborations. We seek to build partnerships for dialogues and to have non-oppressive spaces for trauma-informed and supportive conversations about difficult histories. So the methodology is iterative and ongoing in its development. We look to things like open source and collaborative platforms that we can share with communities and leverage the resources of UBC to assist and engage and support communities in these conversations, in these dialogues. We look to research and pedagogy, we look to curation, but we look to do these things transparently and with participatory practices moving forward. Another project that I'm involved in at the university that I'll briefly touch on is called the Transformative Memory Project. So it's a partnership, it's a SSHRC-funded partnership research project at the university, and it is, there's, two key lead investigators and a number of co-investigators from a number of countries, and it fosters knowledge exchanges. So the idea is knowledge exchange across diverse landscapes. And there's a number of unique and amazing things about this project, but in particular, what I'd like to highlight is it brings together activists, artists, and academics. So it broadens that circle and that conversation around ideas of research. It asks questions of what makes memory transformative. Transformative of what, who, when? When memory is transformative of relations, of oppression, dispossession, and power, when is it not? So it looks to Uganda, Colombia, Indonesia, Peru, Northern Ireland in the US. So it looks to post-conflict society to ask these questions and to partner. So how do place-based and relational ways of knowing inform ways of being in these spaces and being together? So how do we challenge or contest assumptions about memory and transformative memory? So this is the project. We just recently launched the archive, and what you see on the side here, Alit Ambra from Indonesia is a poster artist, and when we were in Colombia, we had an exhibition, and this poster comes from our exchange in Uganda. So Uganda is a post-conflict society. We then traveled to Colombia, and many of the participants have also been here. You can see the picture on the left is from our trip to Uganda. So it's really taking, again, putting agency into the hands of the individuals who it's about, looking at memory institutions, cultural heritage spaces, archiving in a different, more pluralistic way than we're used to. So this is another project, and I'm going to briefly touch on this. It's not a project I'm involved in, but it's one that a number of members of my team brought to my attention a while ago, specifically as we work towards building and making transparent our archival practices and our curation practices at the center. This one does a particularly unique job of it. So the Making African Connections project researches, and I'm pulling this from their content, historic African collections held in the Sussex and Kent museums. And its aim is really to further both the conceptual and applied debate on decolonizing public institutions. So it's starting to do this work through this project. So the first stage of the project is involved digitization of objects of colonial era collections. So what I find, a couple of things I'd like to draw your attention to is their statement, our archival values. So they make quite explicit the challenges of engaging in the archival process. They open the section on archival values with a quote from Rupika Risam, quote, "If the archive itself is a technology of colonialism, can the creation of new archives resist reinscribing its violence?" So they do not answer this. However, they take up an ethical imperative to try. So one way to seek to transparently to do this through making explicit the values, the principles, the approaches that inform their design, their maintenance, the delivery of this entire digital archive. So it's an evergreen, or what they call a live document. So they will continually revisit it and allow for iteration, allow for input, allow for dialogue to flourish. So again, that consultation process is meaningful. So Making African Connections they also engage with the metadata. And what I think is really fascinating about this is metadata is data about data. So it's essentially how we retrieve and describe information in efforts to organize it and make it accessible. So they do an interesting thing around, they have, so in service of transparency and opening dialogue, they're publishing histories of their source catalogs. So they're engaging a response that surfaces the historical context and challenges the normativity of instruments such as museum catalogs. So I think, again, how we do what we do, how we have the information we have, and why it looks the way it looks is really important, because we have hundreds of years of classifying and cataloging through a very colonial lens others. And so when we make explicit how this was done, why it was done, then we can have a better understanding to have fulsome, thoughtful, and truthful dialogues about moving forward in a better way. So there's one more I'll draw your attention to before I close, and that's the Documenting Ferguson project. So this is an online digital archive. Again, this is back to that idea of technology, really putting the tools so people can upload cell phone data here, people can upload, there is a mediating factor. It's done in collaboration with a number of universities who help to support the space. But it's really a resource that works to preserve and make accessible the digital media captured and created by community members, particularly following the shooting death of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri on the 9th of August in 2014. So according to the project, its ultimate goal is to provide diverse perspectives on the events in Ferguson and the resulting social dialogue. So again, we come back to this idea of inclusiveness, this idea of bringing voices that potentially were left out of more formal conversations in cultural heritage institutions and in support of dialogue. So we really think about dialogue as a tool here for moving ahead on issues of social justice and, I would argue, in Canada, reconciliation. So it invites contributions, images, videos, personal stories, and comments into really inviting people into a difficult dialogue with technology, but also with their own agency. So I'll finish there and just share a few thoughts that I'd like to. Is at the beginning, I asked you to hold space for our imaginations. I asked you to hold room for, as I talk through this conversation, of what was possible, what was the role of museums moving forward, how could we do things differently. So again, I would ask us to stretch our imaginations, to really, I would say, embrace boldness. We need to imagine a way forward that allows for courage and for humility to understand what we don't know and the place that we occupy and the place we don't occupy, our own positionality, but the courage to act when we want to affect real change. So as Audre Lorde reminds us, quote, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house," end quote. They will never support and sustain genuine change. She encourages us not to tolerate difference, but to see such necessary polarities as a spark for a much more creative and generative process. Only by acknowledging the equality and strength of difference, she argues, can we find the courage to move forward in uncharted territory and contemplate new actions. So I would challenge us to explore our ambitions, in areas of human rights, anti-racism education, social justice, race, gender, talk about diversity and inclusion, and then act on it. Smartly engage technology, so not as a means to an end, but in service to addressing systemic inequalities. So for instance, social media can be democratizing, but shed light on its challenges as we use it. Be alert to the biases and values baked into these technologies that may not align with those of our institutions, our communities, our societies, or ourselves. Try to generate non-oppressive spaces. Continually ask ourselves what voices are amplified and which are marginalized and or non-existent. Continually revisit our own positionalities. It will shift. It will be different depending on the place you're in, the place you occupy, the seat you have at the table or don't have. So what power do museums hold? Who is missing from the narrative? And can we create non-oppressive spaces for dialogue? Arguably, we can be creative through areas like digital repatriation or just full-on repatriation. We can use digital technologies as potential tools for education and in support of real change. There's rapid collecting projects around COVID-19 pandemic, Black Lives Matter, the Women's March, the election. We can do this in real time in ways that bring far more people into the tent. So I'll share with you the words of Australian archival scholar Sue McKennish and her colleagues that asserts decolonization involves calling out and challenging legacy colonial belief systems, values, embedded racism, classism, sexism, and heteronormativity with the ultimate aim of disrupting and transforming legacy structures and infrastructures, end quote. How we do what we do is changing. We can embrace the opportunities and challenges this presents. In a recent article, Museums as Sites of Learning and Agents of Change, originally published in Roundup, the magazine of BC Museum Association, and republished in Zahor, Executive Director of the Vancouver Holocaust Education Centre, Nina Krieger, calls on museums to be agents of change. She speaks to the action needed to be taken up in order for institutions and professionals to be actively anti-racist in order to effect change. There is new space to explore issues of diversity, inclusion, representation. However, we cannot fully undertake these challenges without turning the gaze towards ourselves and museum and archival institutions and professionals, and interrogate with the intention of dismantling those policies and practices that oppress, and building anew with capacity for pluralism and inclusion. So we must challenge the false immutability of historical narratives that omit marginalized voices and normalize unjust and unequal practices and policies. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That was really a pleasure and enlightening. We appreciate you sharing all this wisdom and these ideas with us, and kudos on maintaining your composure in the presence of such a wild cat.
I'm talking and it's not to her.
We're going to open it up to questions. So if folks are interested in asking a question of Elizabeth, please comment and I will read them out. Perhaps I'll just start with a few ideas until while we gather some questions. The idea that you shared regarding telling the story of how you tell the story, right? Documenting that seems to really be an acknowledgement that the museum is not it is an institution, but it is comprised of people, right, who are trying their best and you know, working within the confines of the moment and their background and their training, etc. And I think that for a long time there has been a reluctance among the professionals to have transparency, to let the public see their, you know, the process, the flaws, the dead ends. Do you feel like that is changing? Do you feel like there's, you know, a greater transition towards transparency? Maybe you have some examples of that. And I guess kind of a follow-up to that is, you know, what is the role of, well, maybe I'll let you answer that first and then come back around to my follow-up. Yeah.
I do. I mean, I tend to be a Pollyanna when it comes to optimism just generally, and specifically in this area. I don't think I would work in it if I didn't think there was hope for change. And I think, you know, one of the strongest things we have is education. I think the momentum that we're seeing in the world, despite the disheartening numbers in the election down south recently, is that, you know, we saw this kind of civil rights, you know, discourse being taken up globally. We saw, again, I'm so sorry for that. We saw the challenges that really people face in systemic injustice. So instead of, you know, just kind of putting in programs or lauding, you know, we really heard from leaders this time that they understood that the challenges were deep-rooted. And, you know, as Justice Marie Sinclair told us after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that it was 7 generations that were taken through the residential schools. It'll be 7 generations before we see anything like reconciliation. So I think we have to understand this is a long game we're playing. And there's a lot of interest, as I mentioned early in the talk, at play here around these tables. So I think that's what's really important, is that we really talk and think, and this is what I mean about disruption and dialogue. And disruption doesn't mean necessarily tearing things down. It can mean dismantling for sure, but it means, again, a non-oppressive space for dialogue to happen so the disruption can be a force of building. so that disruption can be a force of moving things forward. And I really do think that is happening. I think, the students I teach in the archival program at the School of Information. And, when I ask them to hold a critical lens to some of the historical readings we have and to think about these things critically, they're way ahead of me on that. They really are empowered to take up this mantle and do this change. And I think we owe it to them to then have institutions that are ready to receive this really great enthusiasm and energy to affect this change. But at the same time, I'd like to see greater representation of, a broader aspect of a society amongst these students. We still have, I'm very privileged to have gone to UBC, to, work at UBC, but, we're still very elitist spaces for a few. And so we need to open up these spaces for people to participate in fulsome, thoughtful ways and engage in these coming from various walks of society.
And to follow up on that, I mean, that is very optimistic and promising, and good guidance for those of us working in the field. I guess the follow-up is, what role can supporters or members of a museum or museums in general, people who don't work in museums but appreciate them, what is the role they can play to, maybe this is a leading question, but to push us towards improving the way we do things?
That's a great question. And I've worked in different contexts. So at the Holocaust Education Center, I had the privilege of working, and benefiting from an extremely supportive board. I think that, again, you work there too and can speak to that, is that it's an amazing team. But I think the support of the community and the choice to support the work of the center and the board, there were some projects there that we made some, challenging decisions on. And I always had the support and felt like I had the support of that board, because it was an ethical choice they made to do this work in a good way. And I don't know that that's always the case. So I think that's really important. I think holding, as donors, as folks who go to museums, as people who donate, artifacts and belongings and art and money to museums, and we sit around these tables, we have a voice. We can ask for accountability. We can ask for an examination of policies and practices. We can say, do you know that, the truth and reconciliation calls to action, there are some there for museums and archives. What are you doing about that? Have you participated in the broader national dialogues that are looking toward to change these things? What are our hiring practices like? Are we looking towards conversations like this? Do we bring in opportunities for community to engage with the records and put their voice into them, as opposed to just the archivist's voice or the curator's voice? So I think there's many ways that, we can do that. But beyond that, you don't have to be a high-profile donor to do this work. I think conversation, dialogues amongst ourselves, conversations at the dinner table and the breakfast table with our children, with our partners, with our community, and with our families, to really talk about what it means to engage in this together. So when you go, again, I'm assuming many of the folks here tonight are museum supporters, archival supporters. This is the history of communities. And, again, I've had the privilege to work at the JMABC really early in my career for a brief time. Those oral histories that you have, you said 900, that's an amazing collection. Those voices are amazing. And so how are those being surfaced in the community? How are they being used? How are they being recognized? The policies that govern them, are they participatory from the community? So it goes across the board, really, in that regard. And then also, as we look to funding models, are we making those more equitable? They're often quite privileged for people who can navigate those systems, right? So, are we doing that extra work as museum professionals who are quite adept at navigating those systems, to bring in maybe other smaller spaces and training them in getting, the access to those kinds of funding envelopes and things like that? So I think there's a lot of things if we commit to it. That's just off the top of my head on a Wednesday evening. I think if we commit to it collectively and creatively as a community, lots is possible.
Mm-hmm. So we have a few questions from the audience. First, from Sheila. She writes, history is usually written by the colonizers. How is it possible to get a truthful depiction of what occurred if the indigenous peoples did not participate in adding to the archives and museums artifacts, if they didn't give their version?
Right. I think that's shifting. I think that I think you're absolutely right. First of all, thank you for the question and thank you for your attention this evening. I think that's absolutely true. I think that's been shifting, since the TRC and perhaps before in Canada. I think it still has a long way to go. I think when you have Indigenous Studies departments and others, in institutions and in organizations, or sorry, higher learning institutions like UBC and others, that those voices are elevated, and there's a critical discourse that is challenging. I didn't go too far down the rabbit hole of what we do with the Holocaust, at the Residential School History and Dialogue Center, but one of the innovative things we do with our digital systems is hold space for that plurality. So as we're at Aggregate, we bring in records from the National Center, from Provincial Archives, from Library Archives Canada, into conversations for schools and communities with survivor voices. But what we do with those records is we've created a system where survivors can add their voices to those records. So we get a far more fulsome accounting, not just a church narrative or a government narrative. So collaboratively developing systems like that is one way. Looking at policies. Again, elevating, UBC is very fortunate to have its first Indigenous Chancellor, the Honourable Stephen Point, who was the former Lieutenant Governor of BC. We have a new Indigenous Strategic Plan. So as more of those things come into play, DRIPA being adopted by the province, there's a mandate right there for all museums and archives, the public ones, they're mandated to include, to implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So by bringing those into conversation, we bring more voices into that. It's not too late to bring these into conversation. We work with the Royal BC Museum and Archives, as I mentioned, Library and Archives Canada, as well as others, to really bring to augment and attach voices and adjust the records so they are more pluralistic. So when we talk about pluralism and agency, that's really what we should talk about. We've got a lot of work to do, but it's very plausible, and it's a long game.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that, it's on us as the professionals to identify the gaps and do our best to, seek out and fill them in. So there's a few comments that are basically simply appreciations. There's applause from Aaron. There is from Alyssa asks, loving the work Dr. Shaffer is citing and bringing together in this presentation. Is it possible to get a list of the works mentioned this evening for us to read and continue engaging with after the event? Thank you, Dr. Shaffer.
Yes, my absolute pleasure. I'm really glad you enjoyed it, and I can pull together. The first part of my talk is more formal. The last part has more talking points, but I can certainly turn it into a document with references that I can share with Michael that can be passed on. I'd be more than happy to do that.
Thanks very much. Brigitte says simply, thanks so much for a lovely and thought-provoking presentation.
Thank you.
And thank you from Winnie. So we have a question from Professor Chris Friedrichs. Hi, Elizabeth. You addressed some very important issues. Thank you. For example, you tell us that archives are, quote, seats of power that, quote, control the past, etc. Now, what are the implications for our organization? Should we, what are the implications for our organization? We have online exhibits and a big archives. Should we be changing our approach or our practices?
Right. First of all, I greatly admire your work, Dr. Friedrich, so thank you for the question. I think, yes, and I think, that's probably already happening, perhaps, the conversation that Michael and I are having today, and the fact that we're engaging in this conversation seems to me that this is part of the work that the Jewish Museum and Archives of BC has chosen to do, to engage in these conversations. And so I think, I'm a fan of your I was talking to Michael a few weeks ago about the architecture digital exhibition that I'm a big fan of. And I think that I think it's really about examining and figuring out where their space is. So I don't know that it's a whole 180 on things that are being done, but I think it's a thoughtful and engaged examination of the collections, of why the collections are what they are, the lens through which, and again, as I mentioned before, it's not about kind of taking necessarily wholesale redoing, but it's maybe augmenting, it's adding agency, it's being transparent. I brought up the African Digital Archive example to say, here's our catalog, but instead of, redoing a catalog for a nonprofit is phenomenal work. Maybe there's just a primer that says this is why our catalog looks the way it is, or we understand some of the language, and I don't know that this is true for your archive, but we understand some of the language, it is problematic perhaps, and so we're working to address that. But so just building that awareness and planning and engaging in the conversation, making a commitment to work towards some of these practices, and then planning how that should be. I think that really, not fully being aware of what your approach or your day-to-day practices are, I would think that it's really about, doing a fulsome, engaged, and thoughtful conversation with your team and with the community who supports it, and setting some goals for how you think that you should move forward. And that kind of informal audit sometimes surfaces things. Other times, it can surface a lot of things that you're doing right, but some things you'd like to do better. Or maybe you're really on track for the way you want to go, so you have some energy, as I mentioned, to dedicate towards other spaces and places that maybe you could share knowledge with or share resources with in unique ways. So I think that really engaging in those conversations, but a commitment to then, once you have those conversations, to act. I think that's really what potentially is necessary. I hope that answers your question.
You're recalling for me a number of the things that we spoke about on the phone in terms of, humility as an institution, and self-reflexiveness, and reflecting on how you've done things as an institution, and how those ways of being need to evolve sometimes. Yeah.
Absolutely. At the center, we talk a lot about humility and courage. And I think of those things, as I think I mentioned to you before, as two sides of a coin. So like you said, the humility to do that work, but then the courage to act when you see that there's change that needs to be made. And I think we're constantly redoing that. In all avenues of our life. But I think professionally and institutionally, I think that's the thing. Humility is an institution, and courage is an institution. So as you mentioned before, you can have a lot of good actors doing work inside the institution, but sometimes they're working at cross purposes, or they're kind of, working in spite of the institution, as opposed to along the lines of its standard mandate and what they're chosen to do. And people are much happier when they're working alongside, they're working with the flow of their mandate as opposed to against it, or doing things off the side of their desk because they're the right thing to do, but they haven't been afforded the resources, the time, or the support to do them. So I think that institutional humility and that institutional courage is what is really important at this moment in time to move things forward, because it gives momentum. It can't just be on the shoulders of individuals.
I'll give a question now to Aaron DeWitt. Asks, what parallels and distinctions have you found in the goals of and approaches to Holocaust archives, memorialization and education, and residential school archives, memorial and education?
Whew, good question. Thank you for that question. I speak from, as I've mentioned, a particular context, having come from the Holocaust Education Center, gone to the residential school center. So to be frank, much of what I admired and saw as successful and thoughtful and engaged at the Holocaust Center brought into conversation in the residential school space. But obviously, as an Indigenous-centered space, as a survivor-driven space, it's different. And when we think about trauma broadly, then there's been a lot of decades of discourse and work in the Holocaust space that I would argue potentially there's a sophistication there around testimony, around other things that just being a few years out from Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission is not quite there yet. But then there's also different cultural aspects, obviously, right? So when you think about I think about all of the lessons in Judaism that Michael gave me when we were working together at the center, at the Holocaust Education Center, which I'm very much grateful for and pull out to this day. And then again, we think about Indigenous cultures and knowledges and ways of being. So that idea of memorialization in space, place, the land-based education, land-based healing, that is quite different because we're situated in Canada. I think there's some parallels to draw. I think it's again back to positionality. I think it's recognizing that as professionals working in the space and as individuals coming to this, we can never truly know anyone else's positionality but our own. So I think we have to be very careful to not fall into appropriation when we do this work. I think we have to be very careful to not do a one-size-fits-all around collections like these, but there's lessons that can be learned. And I think about, Robbie Weissman speaking with residential school survivors at the symposium at UBC and making some very solid connections, but also allowing and affording space for the distinctions to hold, right? For these things to happen at, a settler colonial state that arguably is still enacting. We still have boil water advisories. We still have overrepresentation. So it's a context that's being lived in. Unfortunately, we're also seeing an alarmingly high rate of anti-Semitism around the globe in the last number of years rise. So I think, again, you can pull those parallels in the sense of the urgency to educate, the urgency to hold space for plurality of voices, the urgency to push against racism, to push against anti-Semitism, to push against anti-Indigenous, anti-Black racism is so present and so necessary. And I coming as an educator at UBC, but also coming from somewhere like the Holocaust Education Center, I think education is one of the threads that I would say goes through all of them. Talking to survivors and being very blessed and fortunate to get to know a number of survivors of the Holocaust Education Center, and then also in the Indian Residential School Survivor Society, and as my work, in my work at the Residential School Center at UBC, what I consistently hear as a thread through is education, is people understanding the history, to not repeat the history, and having a thoughtful, engaged, and respectful way to share this history and these stories with future generations. And the generosity of spirit, the generosity of time and energy that I consistently see from survivors of residential schools and survivors of the Holocaust is continually an exercise in humility for me.
We have one more question here. How does a particularist museum and archives like ours, like the JMABC, position in respect to engagement with broader society? Is it legitimate, to focus on our own Jewish community history for our own community?
I want to make sure I understand the question. So I see it in front of me here too. So how does a particular museum and archives like JMABC position in respect to engagement with the broader society? Is it legitimate to focus on our own Jewish community history? Again, I come back to that positionality. I don't know if it's me to tell you that it's legitimate or not in that sense, but I think that, I don't think we have to, again, we can talk about broadening out these ideas and having conversations and cross-pollinating dialogues, but I don't think, the Residential School History and Dialogue Center engages with VHEC, engages with other, places, but it has a mandate to be survivor-centered around new residential schools. I don't think it's problematic to be centered as the VHEC does, to use the Holocaust to, teach, about the Holocaust, but anti-racism and anti-genocide education, and it's also taught about the Rwanda genocide. It's also, about many things, and so it's a lens that has, obviously is probably the most powerful lens for this kind of work. And so arguably, I would say, I think it's, again, it's not for me to tell an organization what's legitimate, but I would say that internal focus on doing that work is absolutely I would argue, is justified and necessary in the sense that it makes, this is how we come together in community, and our communities are sometimes smaller, sometimes bigger, sometimes quite minute. And I think it's, what you choose to maybe share out from that work, how you choose to maybe engage in those conversations, how, you inviting me, again, with thanks, to talk today about the ways that our work kind of cross-pollinates. I think, there's nothing wrong with being really, really good at a particular thing and then sharing it out, as opposed to kind of spreading yourself too thin. So, again, it's not for me to tell you, but I would say absolutely, it's an amazing collection you have. It's got a mandate. Going back to your mission and your mandate, what are the goals of the mission and the mandate? That should come from the community. And I think that that's really important, and we should be able to hold that space in a good way. And so I think that that's, how then such a community and such an organization chooses to engage more broadly. I think there's tons of opportunity. I think it's just really up to the choice of that community, what they choose to focus on and what's within their capacity.
Totally. And as in the process of developing exhibits and digging through the archives, we find opportunities, right, where we see a match, to work with another institution, and then you know that through that partnership you'll have a richer result. While still fulfilling your own mission mandate, you can help another organization fulfill theirs, and build a stronger relationship. Yeah.
I think that's really well said. Absolutely. I think, and that's it, having a mandate to support seizing on those opportunities, right? To support kind of, again, broadening those conversations so that, and I think it enriches our audiences. The folks that come to us to use the archives, the folks that come to us for exhibitions, I think particularly online exhibitions right now, I think there's a need in the world to share these stories, to hold space for these conversations in a good way. I don't know that it can ever be completely safe, but we can certainly strive for non-oppressive and somewhat safe.
Well, that's certainly something beautiful to strive for, to aspire to. I want to thank you on behalf of all of us for sharing your mind with us today, your thoughts, your reflections, your insight, your crazy cat. But it's been a great pleasure, and just wish that we could have done this all in person. And one day, I'm sure we will.
And again, the door is open at the center. Please make your way there. We'd love to have you and chat more.
Sounds great. So we'll wish you a fair evening, and look forward to speaking again soon. And I want to thank everybody else, all of our attendees, for participating, for joining in this evening, for everyone who shared questions. Thank you. And as you can see, this conversation is never ending, and we will continue it in many ways over the next year as we celebrate our 50th anniversary, and likely over the 50 years that follow. So thank you to everyone. Have a wonderful evening, and we'll chat again soon. Good night.
Good night.